The Second World War left a world in total chaos. No one expected that as a result of those years of war, we would have two new enemies who had been allies during all those years. And the result of that is what we call the Cold War, which is the topic for this lesson. There are so many questions that historians have asked and that still debate today. Here are just a few. First of all, definition. How do we define Cold War? The causes. Who is responsible? Which of the two sides is to blame for it? Remember, this is a war, it's an actual war, but it's a war between two powers. And those powers are the United States and the Soviet Union. The war itself, what is called the Cold War, lasted 45 years, from the end of World War II until 1990. A few of you may remember, most of you were born at the time, however, you were too little to maybe remember what was happening. What was this Cold War based on? First, it was an ideological war. Two opposite and conflicting ideologies that each of the two superpowers had. Those ideologies had existed for a long time, even before World War II began. But those two ideologies seemed to be hidden during the years of the war and then resurfaced when the war was over. It was a competition following the new imperialism, the tradition of the new imperialism. It was a competition for power, and it was a competition for influence across the world, what is called spheres of influence. Each of the two powers wanted to enlarge its own sphere of influence. If you look at this, local conflict, and the local conflict stayed local. It never spread, but stayed in one place. But that doesn't mean that those conflicts were not serious. Millions of people died as a result of those conflicts. So this is the general definition, the features of the Cold War. So now what we're going to do is look at just a few topics related to the Cold War. And the first one that I would like to address is the conflict with Germany. And that is because the conflict with Germany was the result of the breaking of one of the agreements that were signed before during the Yalta Peace Treaty. There were two broken agreements, one by Stalin and the other one by the United States and its allies. Stalin had promised to respect freedom for the governments in Eastern Europe. And he did not keep his promise and imposed Soviet like governments in all the different countries of Eastern Europe. and the Allies did nothing about it. At the same time, Germany is an interesting situation because if you see here, you see that after Germany fell, at the end of the war with Germany, they had decided that Germany would be divided into 4 zones, and each country would be responsible and would be ruling each of those 4 zones. And that was the agreement. But very soon after the situation began to settle, 3 countries decided to unite their zones, and Stalin didn't like that. So Stalin became very angry, felt betrayed, and decided to react by punishing the other 3. And when you look at this map, you will see that Berlin, the capital of Germany, was in the Soviet zone. So what that means is Berlin was isolated from the other 3 zones, and it was surrounded by Soviet land. That was a serious problem. And so Stalin decided to isolate Berlin. In other words, he would not allow any food, any transportation to or from Berlin. In that moment, the United States and England and France had to make a decision. Should they start another war? Now remember, it's only 5 years after they had been signing treaties, peace treaties. And what should they do? Should they bomb? Should they attack? Should they invade? And they came up with a wonderful solution. They were going to bring supplies by air, and this is the famous airlift. So the response to Stalin's blockade was an airlift. An airlift that started very slowly. They were not sure they would succeed, and eventually it was genial. It was an amazing success. The people in Berlin who thought they would starve to death, and I'm talking about the people in West Berlin, because Berlin was also divided into 3 zones. So it was the people in West Berlin that were suffering. And the airlift was a great success, and Stalin had to realize that his threat was useless, and he backed down. And that was the end of, at least for a little while, that was the end of that conflict. The conflict resumed when they decided to build the Berlin Wall, and that Berlin Wall was the symbol of the Cold War for many years. When the Berlin Wall fell, the Cold War also ended. But this first conflict was solved in a very intelligent, smart way without starting another war. Let's look at 2 interesting resolutions that shaped the period. One of them is the Truman Doctrine, and the other one is the Marshall Plan. Both of them occurred very early during the Cold War, and both of them decided the future of the world. the Truman Doctrine was, even though it was not stated, was the beginning of what later came to be called the domino theory, which means we cannot allow one country to fall to communism, because if we allow one country to fall, other countries, like dominoes, other countries are going to fall. This theory, this concept, the dominoes theory, was what shaped the ideology of the United States and its allies during the 45 years. And the actions, the decisions were made based on that. And the Truman Doctrine was the beginning, because President Truman asked Congress to allow money to defend the anti-communist side of a civil war in Greece. Congress approved, and after that it was understood that wherever in the world there was a risk for one country to fall to communism, the United States would intervene with as much money as was needed. The Marshall Plan was a very interesting decision also, because Europe was in ruins. The economy of all the European countries was totally devastated. They needed to reconstruct, they needed to rebuild. And in the Marshall Plan, the United States promised financial aid to help in the reconstruction of Europe. The Marshall Plan did not exclude the Soviet bloc. The Soviet bloc certainly excluded itself, and Stalin believed and claimed that the Marshall Plan was only an instrument of imperialism. But what was fascinating was that the Marshall Plan had two aspects. One was coercion. We are going to give you money, but you are going to behave in the way we want you to behave. An example, in France, France was receiving money from the Marshall Plan, and there was a strike by workers of the Renault car industry, the famous Renault. Well, United States said, you are not going to allow workers to go on strike, or money will stop. The government of France followed the United States guidelines, and the workers could not go on strike. And that happened everywhere. So it was a very good way for the United States to know that all the countries receiving aid were going to follow the guidelines. The other interesting aspect was certainly the countries that needed the money for reconstruction, and their industries were gone. So where were they going to purchase all the materials for reconstruction? From the United States. So the money that the United States gave those countries ended up coming back through the purchases that those countries were making to the United States for materials. So it was a great favor. If you look at this, what it says, investment in peace. There was peace. These countries succeeded, were rebuilt in just a few years. Germany, Japan, France, England, all of them were developing, and the United States economy boomed because of the Marshall Plan. So again, this was a very intelligent decision that benefited certainly those countries who received the money, and even more the United States. And the Soviet Union did not participate in this, so the economy of the Soviet Union was going through a very deep struggle. Stalin did a good job bringing the Soviet Union to industrialize. Unfortunately, the standard of living of the people was not going parallel to the industrialization and all the advances that Stalin accomplished. After the death of Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev tried to start new ideas in agriculture, but it was not successful, and so the Soviet Union was struggling just with survival. So it was a big difference between the economic boom of Europeans who received money from the Marshall Plan and the Soviet bloc, which rejected the Marshall Plan. Cuba and the Vietnam conflict. In Cuba there are two major events, and I have to tell you, when we discuss the Cold War in general and some of these events in particular, up until 30 years ago, what we knew about the Cold War was entirely different from what we know today. Most of the information, at least in the United States, was classified, and what the public knew was totally different from reality. And in the last 20 to 30 years, thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, when a historian or a politician officially requests information, then they have to declassify those documents, and that's how we have found out things that we suspected. Some people suspected, most people heard but did not believe, and so it's really fascinating. It's like a totally new history in the last 20 to 30 years. And one is the Bay of Pigs. And something also that I wanted to mention is it is during this time that a new organization was born, the CIA. And the CIA became the main planner and implementer of most of the actions during the Cold War. And the first that we know of was the Bay of Pigs event, which started before President Kennedy, but President Kennedy received all the blame. It was a total failure. The invasion of Cuba to end Fidel Castro's regime not only was a failure, it caused the death of many Cuban exiles, and it was a big humiliation for the United States and for the administration of President Kennedy. However, the following year, in 1962, there was another event which was very important. I believe that President Kennedy should be given a belated Nobel Peace Prize, because President Kennedy made a decision that saved the world. During the missile crisis, we were just so close to nuclear war. And what is interesting is that even President Kennedy did not know that the Soviets had the nuclear missiles ready, and they were totally assembled and ready to destroy the United States. And if President Kennedy had not decided to defy all the people around him, all his generals, every one of his advisors, all of them wanted an aggressive action in the part of the United States. And President Kennedy decided that he was going to make a decision. And I believe it was on a Friday. He told all these people, all his generals, he told them, look, you have not been home, just go home, and I will tell you what my decision is on Monday. And all of them went home, and he sent Bobby Kennedy to talk to the Soviet ambassador. And Bobby came and said, we cannot continue like this. We are going to listen and to accept the letter that Khrushchev sent. And so we promise not to invade Cuba ever if you take those missiles out of Cuba. And the ambassador said, but we are not happy with that. We want the United States to take the missiles that you have in Turkey and Italy down. So if we take our missiles out of Cuba, you have to take yours out of Italy and Turkey. And Bobby said, I am prepared and I'm authorized by the president to accept that, but that cannot be said publicly. The only thing that we are going to say publicly is that we promise never to attack Cuba. And in exchange, you will remove your missiles. And the ambassador said, okay. And Khrushchev agreed, and even before the generals came back, Khrushchev announced to the world that they were going to take the missiles out of Cuba. And they never mentioned that the United States would take its missiles out of Turkey. So the only thing that the United States promised was, officially, was to not to invade Cuba. And the promise was kept. And the government of Fidel Castro continued, and even today Fidel Castro is still there. So Fidel Castro has survived a great number of American presidents, and he resigned when he wanted to resign and not when the American government told him to resign. So this is a very interesting topic that we discuss, and as you read more documents and as you watch the videos, you'll see how great President Kennedy was, because he and Khrushchev's letter was also very powerful, because Khrushchev told him, you and I have the destiny of the world in our hands. And if we keep this knot and we keep pulling, that knot may not be able to be untied. So let's think about it. So it was both of them deserve really a Peace Prize. And the last topic that we will talk in this introduction is what is called the Second Indochina War, or usually we call it the Vietnam War. And we could spend an entire semester discussing the Vietnam War. But as we focus on the war, I would like for you to look at the 3 C's: the causes, the course, and the consequences. And there are specific events that we need to look at, because the Vietnam War has so many interesting topics and actions that again have been discovered recently, and that are very good lessons for our present and even for the future. But the one thing I wanted to mention is there are, I believe, there are 3 video clips about Vietnam in this lesson. The first one is short, it's very superficial, and it's the type of clip that you would that a history teacher would use in a high school class, without getting into any of the details, the important details of the war. The other 2 clips are more at the college level. But I would like for you to watch the first one, because that is the general knowledge that most people have about the Vietnam War, and they don't pay attention to details. And because the Vietnam War is one of the topics that we deal with in this lesson, and because we are taking not 1 week but 2 weeks in studying this lesson, I would like for you to really go in depth into some of the events and some of the details. For instance, when you look at the causes, start with what happened even before World War II. Look at how Vietnam was part of the land controlled by France, and how the Vietnamese people had been desperate for independence for a long time. And then during the war, or at the beginning of World War II, Japan tried to conquer Vietnam. And then the Vietnamese again were controlled by a foreign country. And then after the war, when they decided to fight, and to fight with all their energy to be independent, as soon as France was defeated by the Vietnamese, then Vietnam was divided into 2 parts, North and South. And for the Vietnamese people, this was a very sad situation, and they really were desperate to have their own country and to have independence. But unfortunately, Ho Chi Minh in the north was communist. He had lived in France for some time, and then he had been trained in the Soviet Union, and he did have communist ideas. And the United States and its allies were not going to allow Vietnam to fall into communism. So free elections were not accepted, were not allowed, and so the North and the South remained separate, and the war began. And then look at a few of the events. For instance, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. We did not know until recently that the reason given by President Johnson to escalate the war was not accurate. So he gave a reason to Congress of what he said was that the North Vietnamese had attacked again when it was not accurate. Historians do not quite agree whether he knew it was not true and he said it anyway, or if he was given the wrong information. But the truth is that the United States involvement, serious involvement in Vietnam, was the result of something that never happened. There are a few other things that happened, like for instance the search and destroy missions, the Operation Rolling Thunder. Most of the people who were or continue to be critical of the US intervention in Vietnam, mention this as one of the examples of how horrible the war was. Well, that's not the reason why we in this class we look at this, at the famous My Lai massacre. First of all, remember that this was the first TV war. For the first time, people in the world could see what was happening, and that was shocking. So the public reacted strongly and against the war because they, every night on their TVs, they could see what was going on, and they could see the destruction, and they could see all what was happening there, and they also could see the dead soldiers' bodies coming back. But the My Lai massacre is important not because it's the only time that there was a massacre. In wars, unfortunately, we cannot ask those soldiers who are in combat to make always the right decisions and rational decisions. And those things happen all the time. So this is not the only time that this happened. But the reason why we talk about it in class and the reason why it's important is because when the people in the United States, even those who supported the government and the war effort, when the people found out about it, that was like the last drop. Public opinion in general changed, and the United States population got ready to end that, what they looked at as senseless, unwinnable war. And the My Lai massacre produced that. So we could say that that is the result of the My Lai massacre, more than the fact that it was a horrible massacre. Well, there were many, too many of those, and too many that we know, and too many that we do not even know. But that was the turning point of the war. And then there was another event, which was the Tet Offensive, which again was another awakening, because the people of South Vietnam, the Viet Cong, attacked several points, but attacked the embassy in where no one believed that they would ever be able to do it, and they did. And that also brought the people to a decision. We have to stop that. Most of the people in the United States knew that there was no way this war would be won by the United States. And more and more soldiers were dying. And more soldiers were coming back with so many psychiatric problems that you would see families disintegration, divorces, so many problems that no one really wanted to continue with that. The newspapers, the TV were publishing all the terrible things that were happening in Vietnam, how Vietnam was being destroyed, the millions of people who were dying, the effects of all those chemicals, agents that were dropped, that were causing problems not only on the Vietnamese but on the United States soldiers. I had a student some years ago, and we were discussing, this was in a classroom here in Oak Ridge, and we were talking about this, and this student was giving a presentation, and she was a student with special needs, and you could tell just from looking at her that she had problems, and she was talking about precisely this topic, and at the end she just said, I am the result of Agent Orange. And because her father had gone to Vietnam, and that was something that really shocked. You could feel the tension in the classroom and the total silence after she said that. Also, look at the Pentagon Papers. This guy, Ellsberg, is still around. I have seen him giving interviews, and he published the Pentagon Papers, which again were another awakening. After they were published, most people were really ready to say, that's it, we cannot have this conflict anymore. Officially, it was known to the world that the United States had been defeated. The American soldiers came back, and very soon after that, North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam, and all of Vietnam became communist. And the interesting part of all of this was the dominoes theory ended up being just a dream, because Vietnam fell to communism and no one else did. And so this was a very, very deep experience and deep lesson for the United States and for the United States government and people. What are the consequences of the Vietnam War, and what are the consequences of the Cold War? I would like for you to think about them, and we are going to look at some of them in the next 2 lessons. And with this, we complete the introduction to this lesson, and I will see you when we discuss the next lesson.